she's a mess head too, just like Jeff. She's mad at me because I fired her and don't let her work for me anymore. She's mad. So they're not going to say anything good about me.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Early on the Saturday afternoon in November, I drove to the burial site outside Moffat in a black Mazda, a rental, with a friend of the channel who lives in Boulder. I was obviously investigating the Suzanne Morphew case in situ. It was a cold, overcast day, and all the yellow crime scene tape, every scrap of it, had been removed. This had the strange effect of arriving at the scene, this is what it felt like, before law enforcement did, and trying to find something out of place between the bushes and the dirt with nothing to point you in the right direction. And so with no markers to guide you, it was easy to feel as if there was nothing there. Obviously, when law enforcement were in the area, well, that is what they were faced with. And what happened was that they stumbled across actual human bones scattered out in the open in that area. And obviously, these have since been removed. And obviously, we'll probably see photos of what they found if and when there's a trial. My point is, even if you're in the area and you know a body was once buried right there, coming back to it as I did with all the markers removed, well, it is very difficult to say actually where the exact spot was. Now, there are 5 other observations I want to share with you based on this trip to Moffat, to the burial site of Suzanne Morphew that I did in November. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I do want to do a follow-up to this episode looking at a visit that we did to Poncha Springs, where we looked at Barry's home in Poncha Springs. We also went into a store there and spoke to somebody there. So that's something I want to deal with separately. And then also I stayed in the Holiday Inn Express, the exact same hotel that Barry stayed in, and so I want to share some of my observations in terms of that. So quite a bit more content coming through in terms of in situ analysis before we resume with statement analysis in terms of Barry's statements. We still haven't completed that. If you're enjoying this episode, if you are happy with or you approve of the effort that I put into this particular investigation, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So 5 other observations. The first one is county lines. And so, when you read about a burial site like this, it's actually taken completely out of context. You read a news story, you're told that there's this place called Moffat, and then you kind of look closely at it. But what's actually happening is it's taken completely out of context. It's a fragment that you're given, and now the real thing is you've got to link it to the fabric of the story, the fabric of this crime, the people that were apparently involved in this case. And so you want to find the context of place. Where does this place fit in terms of the landscape, right? Just the surrounding landscape. And then also in terms of things like corridors, county lines, city limits, all those sort of things. And how is the sort of racial memory, the way that people think of this land and this landscape, how is that part of the sort of cultural context as well? Now, when you drive there, rather than just reading a news story and you're suddenly there, you're just suddenly dislocated from wherever you are to having this sort of microscopic view of blades of grass and dirt. When you drive there, that's one way of connecting yourself from some other place to that place. And I drove there both from the north, that's from the Maysville side, and from the south, and that's from even further south than the Great Sand Dunes. You realize you're also in another county. you realize that that is part of the story as well, that it's inside another county. And you kind of wonder, how much significance should that be given? How much significance did the killer give to burying this person's remains in another county? Did that happen deliberately? Was that just something that flowed out of the circumstances of the site that he chose? Or was it something that involved a calculus of a number of factors? Now, I don't think you need to be a local to understand that there's very little going on in Saywatch. Am I saying it right? That is even the eponymous capital of the county has a smidgen over 500 residents. Everything in this county is kind of small scale. There's not a lot going on, and there's not a lot of resources. It's framed by distant mountains. If you drive down the highway, the mountains are far away. You sort of also feel like you want to get off the road and maybe go to the mountains, but there are no roads that are taking you to them. And so you just really want to shoot through and get somewhere else rather than the sort of nowhere that you feel like you're in. Incidentally, the Ute word Saywatch means sand dune, right? And that also gives you, I think, a sense of just how remote and desolate and, in a way, bleak this area is. And, you know, in miles and miles of virtually empty, featureless landscape, the sand dunes in the south are pretty much the only things that stand out while you're driving. Now, I'm sure people who live there, locals, would say, no, there's so much else that's going on. There are the hot springs and there's this and that. I'm saying if someone driving through the area, you may be somewhat local, but you don't actually live in Moffat or Crestone, right? Then you're not going to find a terrible amount that is of interest to you as a tourist compared to somewhere, for example, next door, right? And so since it's miles and miles of flat road through empty countryside, this is the point. One is tempted to drive faster to get through it. You're not tempted to stop. You're not tempted to wander around. And this is what makes it a perfect burial ground. There's simply no point to stop and get out because there's nothing to see. And the burial site is essentially on the south side, the more deserted side of Moffat. The next town, Hooper, is almost 20 miles away and just inside the county line. There's so little going on there that someone who couldn't make a living out of farming turned their land into kind of a UFO watchtower sort of tourist trap. And, you know, you can decide for yourself whether you think that's really a genuine tourist attraction, or it's just someone who's desperately trying to make something out of nothing, in a sense. By the way, the town of Hooper, which is very close to this UFO watchtower, during the 2020 census, there were only 81 residents. So it's a very, very thin population spread out over quite a vast area. Politically and from a law enforcement perspective, Saywatch County is a good place to commit a crime in Colorado because it has so few resources. And if you doubt that, I think one of the questions you might want to ask is, if you've been asking the question, why is this case taking so long, right? Well, one of the reasons is because it is now moved to some extent to Saywatch County, and they're still trying to deal with the investigation. That's part of the answer, because there are so few resources. There's a much larger and more complicated answer that's attached to that. But I do wonder, did this count into the killer's calculus? If there's so few literally law enforcement officers, what is the chance that one of them is going to stumble across these bones in a field? And ironically, that's exactly what they did. The other thing is, how did the killer find out about the resources, the under-resourced county in terms of law enforcement? Well, wasn't it from drug addicts that were living in the area? And did one of these drug addicts tell the perpetrator this? Now we go on to number 2, flat, not mountains. It may seem an obvious thing that the remains were found on flat land and not in the mountains, in fact, far from the mountains. During my first visit to Colorado earlier this year in the spring, I was under the impression that Suzanne's remains were in the mountains. I don't know about you. Certainly based on comments made by the district attorney and comments made about snow and when the snow was going to melt, as well as when I was there driving through Maysville, because it's just mountains, mountains, mountains constantly when you're in the area of the Puma Path home. In fact, the home itself is just surrounded by mountains. And so when you're in that area, it feels like mountains wall to wall. And at one point, Barry did say that he suspected that Suzanne was up on the mountain, taken to the top of the mountain by a mountain lion. And I remember thinking, if he says that, it's probably the opposite. And it's quite interesting thinking about that psychology now. In any event, what is worse, being exposed, this is going into the criminal psychology, putting yourself in the shoes of the criminal and thinking, what would I rather do? So what is worse? Being exposed in an attempt to bury a body on a mountain. Now bear in mind, the higher you go in a mountain, the less vegetation there is, the less excuse you have for being there, and the easier it is to see you kind of from a distance, from just using line of sight. And now you've also got to say why you were on the mountain. And so the question is, what is worse, being exposed on a mountain or being exposed in the flatlands where there are farmers and mechanics and folks with mechanical equipment and tourists moving around constantly? It would be normal for someone to some extent, be within that fabric.
Continue for
right?
6 miles.
One of the main differences is that you can use an ordinary vehicle to transport human remains through these flatlands. You're not going to have any kind of problem. And, you don't need a 4x4, any kind of specialized vehicle to get to where those remains were, right? And so you have an ordinary vehicle that is used to transport remains, just as we had with Letitia Stork and Chris Watts, using some other specialized equipment in different terrain, let's say even difficult terrain. Remember, Scott Peterson used a boat. That can actually raise suspicion quite quickly and narrow the search as well. Now, the impression one has is that the killer wanted to create a safe distance. The number one thing he was thinking about is, I need to create distance between the actual crime scene, where there have been so many searches and people keep coming back to sniff around. I need to create distance between that and the remains. I've got to get the remains out of this minimum area, this minimum radius where searches are being conducted. And isn't that similar to what Chris Watts did? Isn't that similar to what Scott Peterson was trying to do? He's trying to get Lacey far away from prying eyes. And so that psychology comes across quite strongly when you return to that area. Now we go into the third observation, the relief of the site itself. And obviously that's a geographical term. It refers to the way, the subtle way that the land sort of undulates and there's slight variations in the topography going up and down and that sort of thing. I'll explain in a bit more detail what I mean by that. Now, before we get to that, of all the high-profile cases I've covered, and in November I visited around 9 areas related to the true crime cases we've covered. It's still going to take a while to go through those one by one, step by step, so watch this space. I mean, I covered cases from Chris Watts to Rebecca Zahau to Jodi Arias to the Long Island serial killer. And it's unusual to get access to where, to like the spot where the human remains were found. This is where murder was committed. And yet one can do so theoretically in a couple of cases. For example, at Gilgo Beach, also at Spread Creek Camp in Wyoming, where Gabby Petito was murdered, near Pace, Florida, where Gannon Stalk was found under a bridge. It's also kind of a public area in a sense. And one can do so theoretically along San Francisco Bay in the Lacey Peterson case. And why are all of these sites accessible? Because all of them are basically outdoor sites. They're not on private property. The Murdoch case is sort of in between, where the crime is committed outdoors, although in a semi-access controlled area. It's far more common not to have access to the crime scene or the remains, and instead be confronted by a series of edifices, meaning the facades of homes, such as in the Ramsey case, Mo Wilson, Rebecca Zahau, the Idaho 4 case, Jodi Arias, Oscar Pistorius, Henry van Breda, the murder of Meredith Kircher, etc., etc. And this is because people are very often, if not usually, killed in their homes, especially when women are murdered. One of the main factors increasing deaths in the home is actually gun ownership. In the Morphew case, I believe Suzanne was killed in her home, and the perpetrator had time to temporarily hide her body nearby, but outside the home, just as I believe occurred in the Madeleine McCann case. Now, I believe the body was hidden nearby, not that she was killed deliberately. Now, we don't know for a fact whether Barry Morphew committed this crime, but having been in Indiana, which is where Barry grew up, it is a completely flat countryside. Barry also worked on golf courses, which are kind of horizontal green plains with holes buried in them. It does make one wonder whether Barry wasn't more partial to flat land. What do you think? It's an interesting psychological rabbit hole, if you think about it. Now, in terms of my observations at the scene, in terms of relief, I was surprised by how much relief there was at the scene. And it was quite subtle, but not too subtle that you wouldn't notice it. In terms of the surface, the ground surface dipping down right beside the gravel road and then rising in a kind of lowish mound before dipping again. And these kind of undulations with vegetation on them provides a kind of bunker, a kind of cover from someone that is perhaps walking on the ground in the distance. It also provides partial cover in terms of someone driving from Moffat to the south. And the reason I've went to so much effort to talk about the fabric south of Moffat is that people, you can imagine that there's not a terrible amount of traffic from Moffat to the south, because there's a long stretch of road where there's very little going on. And at the end of that stretch of road is a town with 81 people. And then you've got to go a lot further to get to another kind of settlement. And so you wouldn't expect a lot of traffic on the south side of Moffat, whereas you would expect quite a lot more on the north side. And I do think that's quite interesting. Nevertheless, if someone is driving out of Moffat, through Moffat, towards the south, you wouldn't have a lot of cover. You certainly wouldn't have complete cover. But if you were bent over and digging, it might be tough to see you from a distance. And if it was at night, you could simply sort of cower down and you probably would not be seen. What is interesting is, and that brings us to the fourth point, there would be cover from the one side. So in terms of traffic coming from the south, coming from the Great Sand Dunes, which is a fairly popular tourist attraction, but I think most people from Denver and Colorado Springs would visit the Great Sand Dunes off another road, right? But if someone was coming from the Great Sand Dunes side, then the abandoned trailer provides an interesting kind of blockage to that view. You've got the trailer, you've also got containers. I think there are 2 or 3 containers lying there, and then there's also a big tree. All of that is providing cover for cars that are driving towards Moffat from the south. And so from a distance, that trailer with the tree and containers and fencing, it looks occupied. And so even if you did see a vehicle nearby and you saw someone standing around or walking around, I don't think you'd think too much about it, because you'd think, well, that is where someone lives. And you wouldn't it wouldn't be suspicious unless you knew the area very, very well and you were using that road very often. Coming from Hooper, it would be very difficult to spot a vehicle if it was parked close to the trailer, and even if you did, you probably wouldn't think anything of it. The other side is a different story, as there's plenty of line of sight, especially from the road, except that off the highway and off the dirt road, the burial site, as I say, is fairly obscured, more than you might expect, by bushes. And so this is the bottom line. If someone went there at night or very early in the morning and turned off the lights, the chances of being seen, I think, would be very small. Also worth mentioning, and I say this only because where I'm from, we drive on the opposite side of the road. It's interesting to me that the burial site is on the left side of the road if you're coming from Hooper. If you're driving towards Moffat, the turnoff to Crestone would be on your right. And what that means is you're on the right of the road, and so you've got to cross over to the burial site, which is on the left. And that's not the sort of thing you do. You wouldn't want to make it any more difficult or complicated, a maneuver like that, where you could actually, if you got caught or got noticed, that could possibly mean spending the rest of your life in prison. And so you could imagine the person who did this wants to do something quickly and be discreet about it. And so it makes sense that the perpetrator was coming from Moffat, not from the south side, and that he was driving on the right-hand side of the road, which is the same side that the site is. And if there's no one behind him and the road is clear in front of him, it's easy to slip off the road and for the vehicle to quickly be lost in the clutter of that trailer and the tree. And that's by anyone who happened to look that way from a distance. I also found the surface layer of dirt surprisingly soft, almost like powder. It's so soft one can see how and why one might be tempted by the idea of it feels like you could quickly dig down and bury something or someone there. And I think someone did give in to that temptation. But that's another issue against the mountains as a burial spot. On the mountains, the soil depth is often shallow, the substrate is hard, there are a lot of rocks and stones and gravel to contend with. Digging is also just a lot harder, and it's going to take longer, and you're going to be exposed. Personally, I think the perpetrator had chosen the opposite side of the road, where there's also a road. If he'd chosen that part, the remains would not have been found as soon as they were. But as I say, that side is completely exposed, especially to vehicles that are coming from the south. Number 5, and this is the final point, cross-referencing markers. Now, before I went to Moffat myself, I had a sense that the grave was cross-referenced. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but it would be easy for the perpetrator to find. Firstly, the grave is directly opposite the abandoned trailer. It's right in front of it. And even if the trailer was removed at some point, probably the dead end sign would remain, along with a single dead tree. And that tree and that sign are very idiosyncratic to that area. And the burial site is right there, very, very close to both of them. I'd also be interested to know when the trailer was placed where it was. When Google Maps took this footage in May 2018, it wasn't actually there. So we need a clear sense of how long the body was out there and whether the trailer was present at the time or not. And also who stayed in that trailer while it was out there. For me, the biggest insight that came from visiting this specific area wasn't so much the burial site, but the potential significance of Crestone. Time will tell whether or not or how much that insight really matters in the scheme of things, in the scheme of this case. Thank you for listening. Look out for my coverage on my stay at the Holiday Inn in Broomfield and also the visit to Poncha Springs. I'll be doing that within the next couple of days. And I'll see you guys next time.